delighted that Charlotte Lydia Riley is going to be giving our keynote today, and to introduce her and to chair the session, I'd like to welcome once more, because Ben was with us yesterday as well, Dr. Benjamin Thomas White, who is a senior lecturer in history at the University of Glasgow. Ben, over to you.
A few weeks ago, a question went around Twitter: who's the most famous historian you've met? And I thought of various dignified professors that I've hosted for events. And I thought of Jessica Krug, who I did a workshop with once and who was later spectacularly disgraced and is maybe the most infamous historian I've met. But I thought, no, really, the most famous historian I've met is Charlotte. Charlotte Lydia Riley is a lecturer in 20th century British history at the University of Southampton. She's recently edited a book, Free Speech Wars: How Did We Get Here and Why Does It Matter? It's just come out with Manchester University Press. And she's writing another, Imperial Island, that examines the way that empire continues to shape British social, political, and cultural history in ways that powerful forces prefer us not to think about. Charlotte is one of Britain's leading practitioners of history as a public act, and that gets her into the crossfire frequently, which is the subject of her talk today, I guess: history under fire, why historians need to speak out in the culture war. Charlotte.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ben, for such a glowing introduction, and thanks to Claire for inviting me to be a keynote for this summer school. All of the sessions look like they've been really brilliant, and I'm really happy to have been asked to speak today. As Ben said, I'm a lecturer in 20th century British history at the University of Southampton, and I've recently written about free speech, and I write a lot about imperial history and histories of the Labour Party and gender history and all sorts of things that connect to kind of contemporary British politics and culture. And I'm here to talk to you today about being a historian, and I guess more broadly about being a humanities academic in public, and particularly I want to talk about history and these kind of history wars and how this has sort of developed in Britain recently and transatlantically as well. And I'm happy in the questions to talk a bit more about my own experience, Ben alluded to there, and perhaps some of the kind of things that come from being a historian in public and doing this kind of work in the public sphere. I said in the abstract for this talk that history is under threat in Britain today. History departments are being closed or being threatened with closure. Historical research projects are being defunded, and I'm going to talk about that a bit more in a minute. And historians are being demonised and attacked by politicians and newspapers. The right has always been sceptical of the value of arts and humanities, and they've also always been sceptical of the rights of a broad group of people to pursue the study of arts and humanities. They, like to think of arts and humanities as it exists perhaps at Oxford and Cambridge, and they are less keen on how it exists in other universities around the country. This scepticism that they have fits very neatly into a culture war that is currently raging about identity, history and experience in modern Britain. And I want to talk a little bit today about how this has unfolded, and to make a case, perhaps mostly at the end of my talk, for historians responding not by retreating and hoping desperately not to be noticed, but by working to defend their public role, or to talk about their public role more. And I want to say before I get started that I know that this is easier for some people than for others. The wrath of the Daily Mail and the Twitter mob will always fall more heavily on some people than others. Women, people of colour, gay, lesbian and trans people, among others, will always find that this response is more disproportionately critical and perhaps more often outright violent. I am not calling on anyone to put themselves in a position of harm or to feel that they have to expose themselves to abuse in the service of the greater good of history. I'm saying that some people need to, and perhaps especially those who are insulated from the worst abuse, although as we've seen, actually nobody is truly immune from this. I know too that it is all very well and good for me to make a case for being brave and bold when I have a permanent job and a semi-supportive employer. Some employers or potential employers have a very hazy understanding of the UNESCO definition of academic freedom. which includes the right of academics to exercise their civil rights as citizens, including the right to contribute to social change through freely expressing their opinion of state policies, as well as policies affecting higher education. It also includes your right to criticise the functioning of higher education institutions, including your own. And I think a lot of universities don't agree with that. But I think that history and the arts and humanities more broadly are under real existential threat, and I think we need to fight for what we do. So, with those caveats in mind, British history has become a battleground in a culture war that seeks to carve out two sides on every topic. The first side is nicely encompassed by this quotation here, which is about the group within the Conservative Party that seeks to defend this position, and they've called themselves the Common Sense Group. And on their website, they are proudly quoting this quotation from the Express. So they're kind of, they're happy with this endorsement. This side in the debate apparently values patriotism, tradition, common sense. They see British history as a series of victories to be celebrated. And they mass themselves against the side of the quote unquote woke, a term that has been appropriated from African American vernacular English to attack any attempt to explain the complexities of British history or to recognise the grim legacies of imperialism and racism, or indeed the histories of class inequality or gender oppression. One familiar common sense argument is that we cannot judge people from the past by modern standards, which implies that we've come so far we cannot exercise any critical analysis of the actions of our ancestors. And yet somehow a Whiggish narrative of progress is not enough. In fact, we must never call attention to the elements of British history that might seem shameful in comparison to the present. As far as these culture warriors are concerned, British history is a pageant of spectacular success, of humanitarian concern, and tolerance and diversity, but also a history of military might, economic prowess, imperial power, and cultural greatness. In this telling, we can remember Britain proudly as the nation that abolished the transatlantic slave trade without ever being asked to think of its history as a slave trading nation. Let's see if I can actually make my presentation, there we go. This use of history by politicians has got very long roots, and that's, that's not news because nations are built on national myths. And, all political groups, all political sides, all political parties have historical tales that they like to tell to justify their contemporary British political position. Part of my work is about how the Labour Party uses histories about itself to talk about itself in the present. But there are some kind of markers, I think, that this has sort of ramped up more recently. The use of history was very clear in the Brexit campaign. The idea that Brexit was motivated by nostalgia for the empire has actually become a kind of truism. And there were certainly lots of ideas about returning to British greatness and doing so partly through the racialised control of who belonged to the British nation. So lots of conversations about immigration, for example. I'm never really sure about nostalgia in this context. I think I prefer Paul Gilroy's ideas about a post-colonial melancholia to explain what happened with Brexit, but there's certainly lots of kind of calling back to the past. And arguably it wasn't really empire, it was actually the Second World War which loomed largest in the collective memories of the Leave campaign. The idea that Britain had the spirit to survive Brexit as it had survived the Blitz and Dunkirk, for example, or the Keep Calm and Carry On poster, which was rediscovered by Barter Books in 2000 and sold as a print from 2005, became a defining aesthetic under austerity and contributed arguably, I think, to a national belief in British wartime independence and stoicism, which was really useful for a referendum which drew on the idea of Britain standing bravely alone. Also the argument that Britain had once saved Europe and so reserved the right to walk away. These are all kind of historical narratives. But it wasn't just the Leave campaign that has a complicated relationship with history. Central to the Remain case, or certainly I think central to the Remain case in England, was the idea of Britain as an outward-looking, tolerant, internationalist, humanitarian, liberal entity. And membership of the EU became very bound up with preserving those quote-unquote liberal values. And I think people often on the face of it think this is a less problematic reading of history, but actually it's, I think, a disavowal of how central racism and xenophobia has been to Britain's past. The history of British values can't be extricated from the history of empire, for example, or the histories of class and patriarchy. And I think, if anything, the Remain campaign has actually heightened its embrace of this rhetoric of inherent British values since losing the vote. There's a kind of running lament of a Britain that's been lost since 2016, or perhaps lost since 2012, because this is a narrative that often harks back to the Olympic opening ceremony as celebrating a particular type of Britishness that should be preserved. And the Windrush scandal, which saw British citizens of post-colonial origins forced to prove their right to work, to receive medical care or reside in Britain, was caught up in this narrative. Remainers often framed their concerns around the Home Office's creation of a hostile environment as somehow connected to Brexit. And that really ignored, I think, the much longer histories of racism and anti-immigrant feeling in Britain, and also undermined the lived experiences of people in colour in Britain for decades before the campaign to leave the EU actually started. So, you know, it's complicated, and I think historians had a tendency perhaps to call out one side more than others, but I think, you know, both sides were doing really problematic things with history in this period. And so historians, you know, during the Brexit campaign did start to try to offer a corrective to this narrative. And I think that was probably the first time that I'd been at Southampton for a year, I think, by that point. And, you know, it was the first time that I started to, I think, to do more of this, to do more writing in public and to kind of talk about history in the context of this political debate. Being a historian trying to engage with politicians' ideas about history is a very thankless task and is an uphill struggle, even critiquing specific errors. So Daniel Kaczynski's, who is a Conservative Party MP, repeatedly stated that Britain had received no money from the Marshall Plan, despite the fact that Britain was actually the largest single recipient of Marshall Plan money. And I, you know, I've kind of put an example on the slide. I sort of tweeted that this was nonsense. I wrote a PhD on the history of the Marshall Plan. Britain was the largest recipient. You know, this correcting is it goes completely unnoticed by the MPs in question. They don't care. It goes unnoticed by the targets of their messages. This error was picked up by the press actually and became the target of you know, became the subject of some news stories. And Kaczynski actually did eventually admit that he was wrong, but I'm not sure this actually had much effect on the national conversation. And he, you know, he got what he wanted by making this statement. He got plenty of people to agree with him. The idea that Britain had kind of sacrificed itself. And, you know, historians, as I said, you know, aren't neutral actors. And I think a lot of historians in the Brexit debate were happy to jump on one side of the debate and castigate them for historical errors, and perhaps turn a blind eye to some of the mistruths and simplifications on their own side. There was an effort by some Leave supporting historians to set up a campaign group, Historians for Brexit, which argued that history supported an independent Great Britain. I think the narrative they set up was like, from the Romans to the Reformation, Britain had always been independent from Europe. And this, you know, so that was kind of one group of historians, and this was immediately countered by a loose coalition calling themselves Historians for History, who pointed out that this was somewhat ahistorical, and I should kind of say I was one of the people who wrote the letter for Historians for History, and I was one of the kind of named signatories. The story on the slide is a Financial Times attempt to kind of cover this debate between the groups of historians, which is hilarious, because the way the journalist does it is he just goes to Cambridge and has lunch with different people in Cambridge colleges, and this is how he covers this entire debate. You know, nowhere else exists, it's just the Cambridge faculty, the history faculty at Cambridge. But I think, yeah, in the kind of debate more generally, academia was really typified as being Remainy, to the extent that Leave voters working in academia started to complain that they felt silenced, or even that they felt persecuted. And you know, you got kind of academics saying, you know, you can't talk, you can't voice pro-Brexit thoughts in academia, it gets shut down, pro-Brexit events get shut down, you know, students apparently don't feel comfortable kind of saying pro-Brexit ideas. And I think this is really important because it worked to reinvigorate a narrative that has been pervasive for some time, that academia is an ideologically very homogenous space, full of raving lefties. There's a lack of ideological diversity on campus, and that right-wing voices in academia are themselves a persecuted group. And this idea, I think, is fanned by a right-leaning press, which is dominated by journalists who mostly in Britain, again, certainly in England, mostly attended one of two universities several decades ago, but are very keen to write stories talking about campus politics, and are particularly keen actually to write about topics like safe spaces, trigger warnings, no platforming. which are things I wrote about in the free speech book as being kind of totemic ideas that have become very important things for people outside universities in the way that they think about how universities work, even though actually those of us in universities probably don't interact with these concepts all that much. And I think this really contributed to the development of a narrative that universities are not spaces of intellectual rigor, they're not even spaces of kind of learning and teaching, but they're ivory towers that teach Mickey Mouse subjects to snowflake students who know nothing about the real world. Conservative students in these spaces have their free speech threatened by lecturers and student unions who come together to ban the sun. And a lot of this language, so a lot of this comes straight from anti-political correctness campaigns in the 1980s. You know, this is exactly the same as councils being castigated for telling children they can't sing Bar Bar Black Sheep anymore. But it also comes from America. So in the United States, the organization Turning Point keeps a watch list of left-wing professors, and students can add their professors' names to this list, which exists in public and makes people into the targets of attack. And Turning Point UK was set up in Britain in 2019 and was immediately praised by Jacob Rees-Mogg, Priti Patel, among other conservative politicians, as being an important corrective to what they thought was a kind of, you know, left-wing dominance of university campus culture. And as well as being quite, you know, alarming to those of us who might find ourselves on this list and might find ourselves kind of the target of abuse. This is also really instructive, I think, about how the Conservative government thinks about universities and their relationship to them. They don't think about universities as being kind of part of the state that they appreciate and think is important. A government that cares more about the bottom line than education as a public good found that attacking universities, and particularly attacking the arts and humanities, was a really useful way to signal to a lot of its base what it stood for, who it cared for, what it didn't care about. And, you know, and I think this has had quite important consequences. So to come back to the history-culture war in the present, then, we can understand this as a kind of transnational phenomenon. And obviously, you know, it's happening in lots of spaces in different ways. So Orban's Hungary, for example, Erdogan's Turkey have been, and Modi's India have been incredibly hostile environments for academics to work in for some time. The United States, obviously, as well, a lot of our culture war, as I've said, is kind of borrowed from this. President Trump hosted the very first White House Conference on American History in September 2020. And he did so, he said, to celebrate the fulfillment of 1,000 years of Western civilization in America. But as well as this celebratory tone, he was also explicitly motivated by the concern that left-wing historians were seeking to undermine American history with, quote, a twisted web of lies in our schools and classrooms. And when he launched this American History Conference, he talked about the need to defend American history against initiatives like the New York Times 1619 project, right, which he believes rewrites American history to teach our children that we were founded on the principle of oppression, not freedom. The very clear fact that America represented the opposite of freedom for millions of enslaved Black people is obviously completely absent from Trump's narratives. But, you know, Trump is not only kind of expressing his own understanding of American history as very partial and very political here, but he's also kind of signaling to his supporters a particular type of historical narrative. The little quotation on the slide is also from this talk when he opened the first ever White House American History Conference. It says, because of an order I signed, if you demolish a statue without permission, you immediately get 10 years in prison, for which apparently he was applauded. There have been no statues demolished for the last 4 months, incredibly, since the time I signed that act, right? Which kind of casts the idea that before this point, there was like a wave of statue demolishing going across America that was instantly ended by executive order. It's just a really kind of strange narrative to set up. But, you know, this clearly has bled over into the British context. And the summer of 2020 and the moment at which the Black Lives Matter protesters succeeded in toppling the statue of Edward Colston, obviously as I've pictured on the slide, and throwing it to the bottom of Bristol Harbour, was a moment, I think, when British politicians on the right sort of saw with alarm similar things happening in Britain. And these protesters were also accused of trying to erase history or trying to rewrite history. And it was argued by many people that By removing Colston from the streets of Bristol, these protesters were preventing people from learning about Colston's role, both in the transatlantic slave trade, but also in his kind of philanthropic role. But of course, removing a statue is not the same as scrubbing someone from the historical record. And again, historians had to kind of interject themselves into the debate to try to make this clear. Historians do not teach history by using statues. We tend to use books. We do, we often talk about statues and use statues, but we don't use them to learn facts about the past. Statues by their nature are impressive, imposing, valorizing objects. They have a purpose that's very interesting, but that purpose is not to tell people about what really happened. But the idea of community action to rewrite local and national histories through acts like toppling Colston was threatening to a conservative establishment who, as I said at the beginning of this talk, is only interested in a particular type of historical narrative about the United Kingdom. And because that narrative is fixed in their mind, all work to amend it becomes a threat. All work becomes an erasure, rather than being seen as the work that historians must necessarily do, that communities must necessarily do. And I think in Britain I was going to say this came to a head with the National Trust, but that is perhaps counting our chickens before they. It is absolutely possible that something even more ridiculous is going to happen next week. But one of the ways in which this has come to a head is in the response to the National Trust document known as the Colonialism and Historic Slavery Report. So for anyone who's not familiar with this report, firstly, I would urge you to download it because it's available for free on the National Trust website, and it's an incredibly interesting report that clearly many of its critics have not read. It brings together the work of 11 authors, some of whom work for the National Trust, some of whom are kind of independent contractors, and it has lots of advisors kind of associated with it as well. And it set out to establish the colonial connections of National Trust properties with a particular focus on connections with the transatlantic slave trade. And it starts with sort of some pieces exploring different intersections between colonialism and country houses. So it talks about kind of material culture, there's some stuff about kind of geography and things. And then at the back of the report, there's a gazetteer of key properties that have connections to the histories of colonialism and the slave trade. So a really kind of glaring example is Speke Hall in Merseyside, which was variously owned by a pro-slavery MP, Richard Norris, but also a plantation owner and a rum and sugar trader, Richard Watt, who financed slave trading passengers and purchased his own ship to trade in enslaved peoples himself before passing the hall and plantations to his descendants, who then received compensation following the abolition of slavery in 1834. And I think, so Speke Hall is very obviously a house that is deeply imbricated in the violent and exploitative history of slavery. But the report also includes a number of properties where the relationship to colonialism is a bit different. So, for example, Allen Bank in Cumbria is in the report, mostly because William Wordsworth lived there and he and his sisters were very vocal in their opposition to slave trade. So it's a thoughtful and nuanced piece of work. It's not just about kind of marking out these properties as being sort of tainted. But despite this, the report was immediately controversial among certain sections of the press and the British political establishment, not least because of the inclusion of Chartwell in the report, because Churchill had voted against the 1935 India Bill that would have granted the colony dominion status. The first Telegraph headline on the report is the one on the left of the slide, Churchill's home on BLM list of shame. The Daily Express reported that Jacob Rees-Mogg had called the National Trust shamefaced, and that Anne Widdecombe had raged against the smearing of Churchill. The Spectator called the report a shameful manifesto. After this first story, the Telegraph ran a series of pieces decrying the report as variously woke nonsense, self-flagellation, depthless virtue signalling. National Trust members were encouraged to complain to the organisation or to leave the organisation by newspapers. Many of them, and many others who read these papers, and I think it has to be said that actually a lot of the opposition to this comes from people who are not National Trust members, also sought out individuals, and they particularly sought out Hilary McGrady, who is the Director General of the National Trust, and Professor Corinne Fowler, who's the lead researcher on this project, and targeted them with abuse. Some complaints, but mostly abuse. And perhaps even more worryingly, the government itself has colluded in this. So a week after the report was released, Oliver Dowden, the Culture Secretary, warned museums that they should not be taking actions motivated by activism or politics, and hinted that if they did, they might find their money cut in the government spending review. And then he called 25 organisations to a meeting and told them that they had to defend our culture and history from a noisy minority of activists constantly trying to do Britain down. He also said the Colonial Countryside Project, which is run by Corinne Fowler, would never receive any more government funding because public funds must never be used for political purposes. And we've seen this go beyond the National Trust. So the lead trustee of the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich has resigned because the government has refused to allow them to appoint people to do decolonisation work. Just this week, Churchill College at the University of Cambridge disbanded their working group looking at decolonising the college because of complaints from Policy Exchange, which is a think tank, which is running a History Matters project, which is aiming to resist attempts to rewrite history from a woke perspective. You know, this is happening everywhere and it's happening in public. And so to very briefly conclude, I said at the beginning that this work comes with more penalties for some people than others, and that some institutions will be more supportive than others. And I think it's also true that the work that is most timely might be the work that is most likely to drag its author into a hostile spotlight. And nobody should be forced to put up with abuse, but equally, nobody should be cowed from being able to speak about their work in public. We should be able to do this work in public, right? We should be able to talk about what we're doing. And I think as a profession, we need to take a stand against employers who want us to do public engagement. They want us to do impact case studies. They want us to go on Newsnight and the Today programme. They want us to write columns in The Guardian. They probably also want us to write columns in the Daily Mail, but they refuse to support us when this public role turns nasty. And we need to say as a profession that we have a public role, and we might do some of that in service of our institution, but actually we're really doing it in service of our colleagues and our community and our work. And we need to speak out because this is a culture war, and we're in this whether we like it or not, right? This is happening whether we intervene or whether we don't. We need to resist the urge to defend our subjects, which do not need justifying. The work that we do is important, but we need to instead make strong claims for the continued relevance of what we do in a society that can't exist without us. So I'll finish there and would be delighted to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Charlotte. Let me also add my applause there. And thank you also for coming in at 24 minutes and 45 seconds. Excellent timekeeping. Which leaves us plenty of time for questions. Folks, if you'd like to ask a question in person, then by all means raise your hand with a wee reaction there. I'll try and keep an eye there. I've just done that on my screen. I'll try and keep an eye on everyone. But equally, you're welcome to add questions in the chat, which I will try and keep track of and pick up on. I may miss questions because there is also a chat going on. In the chat, you may have seen that Claire has posted a link to the National Trust report, that the Emotionally Demanding Histories group at the University of Edinburgh has been mentioned, etc. One question that has come in is from Jessica Sechmester-Urquhart. Hi, Jessica. Good to see you here. Who has been doing public work around on TikTok particularly, and has noted that they get a positive response, that people appreciate it, but that it's also draining, especially for research with disabilities, even without having been targeted by media or individuals, as some people are. How can researchers speak out and keep our health? This is a question that came up in our discussion yesterday too. Charlotte, any thoughts?
I think it's a really important point to raise, and I think there's a couple of things to say about it. I used to say, and obviously on an individual level, I would still say this, that no one has to do this work if they don't want to. And I think on an individual level, that's true, right? But I think on a kind of, as a body of scholars, we do need to be doing this. So I think the first thing to say is that generally we need to think, as I said in my talk, about who this impacts on most, who's most likely to come under fire. We also need to think about the fact that this work is often not considered, or has often historically not been considered to be proper work, right? That doing public engagement and maybe not doing work that is kind of formally tagged public engagement, doing work which involves talking to the public, doing work which involves kind of communicating stuff broadly, is often just not seen as being as important, as promotable, as hireable as writing a 4-star article for a reputable journal, getting your monograph out, this kind of thing. And when you have a job with a contract, you know, it's very easy. It's very easy for me often to think about this work as something extra that I'm doing, you know, something kind of interesting that I enjoy, and that's partly comes from the idea that it's not somehow as valid as other academic work. It's not proper history, or, you know, proper whatever kind of field you're working in. And I think part of protecting our health comes by pushing back against that and saying, no, this is work, it is draining, it is difficult. It's also something that people are good at and should be celebrated for being good at. You know, some people take to this really well and I think make it look easy, and therefore people think that they're not working, and that's not true. It's about making sure that it's kind of credited and where appropriate paid as well, that this is work that you are actually recompensed for. And I know that's hard. It's very easy for me to say, make sure that we're paid for this. Of course, that's not how the world works. But, you know, it's important for us to set precedents that this is work that we do that's paid. When I write for a public sphere, when I write for The Guardian, for example, I'm always paid for it. Because it's work, but also out of the principle that, you know, this should be kind of recompensed. And I think there's also a kind of sense with a lot of this public engagement that you're really encouraged to kind of do your initial public engagement, make your TikTok, write your article, and then sometimes you're kind of pushed to interact with critics and with kind of criticism in a way that's not healthy. So for example, when I've written articles, I've always resisted the idea that I should then go below the line and start talking to commenters. I don't want to do that. I'm not going to do that. It's really easy to feel like you need to take people giving you very critical negative feedback seriously, that, you know, part of you have a responsibility to kind of interact. You don't have to do that. You know, you don't have to respond to people who are throwing hate mail at you, or maybe slightly less than hate mail, to throwing very critical stuff at you. So I think a lot of kind of trying to keep your health is about working out the difference between putting the work out there that you're interested in and then trying to not feeling like it's a problem to kind of shield yourself from what comes back at that. And of course, demanding that institutions shield us from this more as well. That if we're doing this work as part of our jobs, if we're doing this work as part of who we are as kind of academics, we should expect that we should be protected by the union, by our institutions, by our colleagues from the kind of negative stuff that we get that comes back from that. Sorry, that was quite a long answer, but I hope that was kind of useful.
It's a pretty comprehensive and useful one, Charlotte. Thank you. When you were talking about the National Trust report and the example of Speke Hall, I grew up in Liverpool, and Speke Hall was the classic destination for school trips and also family days out. I remember going to Victorian Christmases at Speke Hall. Wonderful occasions, no mention of where those Victorians were making their money from. We have a couple of related questions that have come in the chat box, which I think can go together. Micah Dinger asked if you have any thoughts on, and I'm sure you do, on the One Britain, One Nation debate blowing up just now, which is closely related to schools and therefore to a question from Ruth, and the move away from critical thinking in the education system and how we teach British history. So what role does school outreach play in changing attitudes towards history?
So on One Britain, One Nation, I mean, my first response was just that it's profoundly embarrassing, isn't it? Like it's deeply, and it's profoundly embarrassing in a way that I'm sure like in 20 years when I'm writing about this period in modern British history, I will highlight this as being, you know, a moment of particular cultural anxiety among a particular group in Britain who clearly feel very threatened by cultural changes that they're trying to kind of implement this. Sathan Sangera said earlier that it's you know, it's Empire Day all over again. And it is, you know, one of their suggestions was that children should be encouraged to dress up in red, white and blue to go into school. It is frightening in terms of the kind of explicit nationalism. It's also kind of frightening in the fact that this is a private organisation that the government has decided it's going to promote for some reason. And I think it opens up all sorts of other ideas about cronyism and how this government makes policy, which seems to be largely kind of ricocheting from one kind of alarming thing to another without any real kind of understanding of what it's doing. So I think it has a long history, this thing, not least the fact that they obviously don't understand Northern Ireland exists, which is obviously a long history in British identity. In terms of school outreach, I think school outreach is really important. I used to do a lot of WP. As part of the way I funded my PhD was I worked for the widening participation department at UCL, and I did a lot of work with schools. I think where school outreach falls down is where we think about history. Historians in universities sometimes have a tendency to think about school history as a preparation for studying history at university, and try to make interventions in the curriculum in order to make our jobs easier, right? So we say, oh, we want you to do X, Y, and Z with children. Why don't your 18-year-olds arrive with us already able to do this, this, and this? You know, why don't they know what a footnote is? Why have they never encountered historiography? And that's deeply unhelpful, I think. If we want to help schools to develop, you know, interesting and progressive history curricula, we need to do it by working in tandem with them. And actually, when Richard Evans kind of was very influential in overseeing a lot of the kind of refocusing of the history curriculum, Peter Mandler also was a key figure in this. They did do that quite well. They worked with schools. They thought about what schools needed. They thought about, you know, most children will stop studying history at 14 in England, certainly. And then, you know, many of them who do A-level will not go on to university or GCSE. So I think it's really important that we make resources available to schools, that we help teachers in any way we can, but without kind of wading in and making it appear like we know best, or that we have any kind of ownership over this. So I think, you know, making resources that schools can use is a brilliant thing to do, rather than trying to get them to teach in a particular way or cover particular topics.
Thank you. You may have seen in the chat there that Ruth has shared a link to the Scarfix spoof about notebooks being given to children so they can report fellow pupils who aren't singing loudly enough, though they'll probably be reporting their teachers first. We have a question here from Iona Ramsey, asking if you think it is helpful to use the term war, which might reinforce the sense that the right needs to defend or protect history because it's under attack. And if we're thinking in metaphors of war, what do you think of the idea of de-escalation?
So I think that's a really interesting question. And for a while, I was quite convinced by people, kind of progressive voices, who were saying, you know, don't fall for the culture war, right? Like, don't let them get away with the culture war because they're using it to distract from other things. The culture war is a way of kind of amping up conservative support because they don't want you to look at X, Y, Z. And I was quite convinced by that for a while, but actually now I think we're beyond that point. I don't think we can avoid it, and I think it is a war. I think the treatment of people like Priya Gopal, for example, both by media, but also by politicians and by her own university, the treatment of Corinne Fowler, someone in the chat has pointed out the National Trust has actually been very good in supporting the authors of that report, but the treatment that she received, including having to be put under police protection at one point because the threats she was getting were so kind of personalized and violent. I think the right has, and kind of spaces like the internet obviously don't help with this, but we are in a space actually now where this is an appropriate metaphor. I think the idea of de-escalation is great in the sense that I think actually one of the things I think historians can do very much in this is actually explain what it is historians do. I think a lot of the time there is a real kind of sense that if historians are kind of changing narratives, we're rewriting history. There's lots of stuff about lots of confusion about the idea that there's no kind of true story or no single story about the past, for example, and a lot of this has kind of escalated to the idea that we simply make things up based on our own political perspectives. And I think, one way of de-escalating actually is sort of getting historians to be a bit more visible about the work that they're doing and why we do the work we do, and how we do it and how we're skilled, and what kind of processes we use, and how what we do is as academically demanding as what scientists do, you know, that we have kind of a research rigor, we have kind of hypotheses that we test and all of the rest of it. And I think perhaps one way of de-escalating is to be ever more open about what it is that we do as a profession, so that it's not just a sort of shouting that we're experts and people should listen to us, or shouting that government ministers are stupid, which I don't think is helpful at all, because, you know, it kind of pushes this narrative that we are just elitists who don't care about ordinary people and don't care about British people's understanding of their own past, which is obviously very important. And so I think it is a war, but I think it's one that, yeah, we need to be more creative to come out of well, maybe.
Thank you. That's a really good answer, and I completely agree with you that it's essential for us to show what we're doing when we do history, and to make that clear that history, for example, is rewriting. That's all it is, and that's a good thing. There's a question here from Dan Cruikshank, presumably not that Dan Cruikshank, who which resonates with something you were saying in your discussion of historians and disputes over Brexit, asking how we can help to educate people who see themselves as liberal or progressive about British history, because Dan has seen, as we all have, lots of folk on Twitter talking about One Britain, One Nation as fascistic and therefore sort of foreign to Britain, whereas, as you said with your points about Empire Day, it's clearly part of a deeply rooted strand in British public life. So yeah, what do we do with folk who think of themselves as liberal but are then falling into their own historical misconceptions?
I have this a lot because part of the work I do is a history of the Labour Party, and my PhD was partly about the Attlee government, which is a real kind of shibboleth of Labour Party history, right? The Attlee government is the one that everyone wants to look back to and say this was the good Attlee government. They created the NHS, and my PhD is all about the second colonial occupation of the African colonies during the Attlee government, and about colonial exploitation during that period. And one thing I find deeply frustrating about trying to do any work with the Labour Party, which I've kind of dabbled in on and off trying to speak to them, or, you know, I've spoken at conference and stuff like this, is that they're really committed to the fact that, like, historically they have been an anti-racist party. Historically we were anti-imperialist. Historically, you know, the Labour Party is a force for good in the world. So historically you were very pro-empire. Historically, the Labour Party, you know, the Labour Party wrote the 1965 white paper on immigration. There are real problems with Labour trying to take a progressive approach today in the world by saying we have always been progressive, we have always been anti-racist, and it's really hard, particularly when engaging with actors like that who are having to use history in a particular way. Having to sort of manipulate history in a particular way in order to kind of to do something in the here and now. It's really hard to get them to take a more nuanced approach, right? It's really difficult to get people to think, actually, you know, we need to be much more, we need to think much more carefully about our histories. And like Dan says, you know, these kinds of explicit patriotism and imperialism, this is distinctively British, right? This is such a British thing to have a song called Great Britain, One Nation, right? It's inherently embarrassing, but it's inherently British. There's no way in which this can be divorced from the last 100 years of British history. But you are always going to come up against that idea that Britain is somehow a liberal, tolerant nation who has a kind of positive history, and it's quite odd in a way, because those people are often people who are quite open to things like the National Trust report, right? They're open. They would normally, I think, be the people who were perhaps more open to the idea that yes, there had been, you know, we can think critically about connections to slavery and colonialism, but they still somehow kind of hang on to this idea that at its heart Britain has a sort of liberal, tolerant narrative. And I think I guess it's really about doing more of that kind of National Trust work, isn't it? It's about doing more of that work to kind of pull out these particular stories, so that you kind of chip away at that general idea by giving them more and more examples that demonstrate that that's not generally the case. But it's hard. It's really, really hard.
Thanks, Charlotte. Yeah, persuading people that they need to rethink their own self-image is not much easier when you're talking to people on the left and on the right.
No.
We are a bit over time. We're coming up to 20 past. You may have seen that in the chat there have been a couple of really useful additions. A link to a new book by Alex Renton, Blood Legacy, about his family's own connections here in Scotland to the slave trade. My institution, the University of Glasgow, has done some good work on this as well, although there's always pressure in the other direction. It's notable that just at the same time that the University of Glasgow issued its report on its connections with historic slavery, the School of Engineering renamed itself after James Watt, with his connection with the University of Glasgow, which one of our researchers had clearly identified he himself and certainly his family were slave owners. There's also a link here to a report on estates in the Western Isles and the Highlands with historical ties to the slave trade that my colleague Andrew McKillop was involved in putting together. Here is one last question, I think, if you're happy to take one, Charlotte. Yeah. About whether there's a role for working with communities about knowing their local history or histories and how they tie into global narratives as a counterbalance to the anti-woke narrative that's coming down.
I really think there is. I think it's a really, really productive thing to do. I've got more and more convinced actually that the way to do really good public history is to start with the hyperlocal and kind of move out, because I think it stops it just kind of avoids some of those huge kind of narratives about what Britain is and what Britishness is, and it enables you to in fact draw down into small communities and then kind of build back up. You know, if this community was like this, what does it mean for kind of a nation? Or Radhika Natarajan in her work has always said that, you know, what we can most fruitfully do with global histories is actually do local to local connections in a global context. We can't write the history of the world, but we can write the history of a small town in Lancashire and a small town in France or in the Caribbean or whatever. You know, we can make kind of connections between smaller groups and think about how individuals made those connections as well. And I know that Catherine Hall, who I think, as far as I can tell, is sort of on a one-woman campaign to kind of draw connections to every single part of slavery, connections to British history. I know that what she's really recently been doing is working with a church in, I want to say Suffolk, and they have a plaque on the wall which is about which is a memorial or a kind of commemoration to a slave trading family. And she's been working, I saw her give a talk where she spoke about the kind of specifics of this connection, and she was able to really richly texture like what it meant for this connection, who this family actually was, what they actually did. And had also, I think, been working with the community because they've hit up against the fact that it's a listed church, and so it's difficult for them to actually remove things like this, and they can't necessarily just kind of pull down a 200-year-old memorial. And I think sometimes, you know, people who might instinctively be quite hostile to these ideas on a national picture, perhaps if you do stuff on a local way, and so, you know, part of this is not necessarily about getting rid of these histories, but it's about saying, well, okay, let's learn more about this family then who did this. Let's think about the actual history of them having traded and enslaved peoples. Let's actually think about the kind of textures of that, what actually happened, what was the experience of them and of the plantations and various things. You know, you can build an understanding of why it is historians want to add this extra detail, rather than just it appearing that we're just trying to, you know, kind of ruin everything with our woke stories. You can sort of show that doing this is learning more about the past, not less, right? We're not getting rid of anything, we're adding things. And that surely, for local communities who are interested in their history, surely, you know, adding things is a good thing. So yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Thanks, Charlotte. And I feel nicely vindicated in the project on local global histories that I was trying to get going with Glasgow museums before the pandemic interrupted it. But thank you. everyone, you have surely seen that there's some really interesting and useful resources coming up in the chat here. Almost too many to keep track of. Alison Hadfield has linked to the new manifesto from the Museums Association about learning and engagement around activism and contested heritage. Rob Witts has linked to a British Library project, Unlocking Our Sound Heritage. The chat will be saved, and Claire, I think links to all of these links can be saved and circulated, if that's right. And it's a mark of how stimulating the talk has been and the discussion that around the question and answers, there's also been this kind of blossoming of discussion and resources in the chat. So Charlotte, thank you very much. And I'm now going to hand back to Claire.
Thanks very much to everybody for their contributions, and to Ben and Charlotte once again. That was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, for chairing, and Claire for inviting me. And thank you, everyone, for really interesting questions, for sharing really brilliant resources. I've grabbed already some of these links that people have put in there, so thank you for that. And I'm glad you enjoyed the talk, and enjoy the rest of the summer school. The rest of the sessions look great and really stimulating.